Hello and welcome to Global Strategy Forum, yet again in this wonderful hall that we're all so used to, but of course, yet again, it's empty as we fight on with the pandemic, but we bring you what we can, when we can, to keep you up to speed with all the great material that we're producing for you to digest as we go along. At time of recording, we're all considering even more drastic measures about the new variant and other considerations, and so that's lurking in the background, but what we're here to do is launch a publication and present it to you, and we have some wonderful guests here to share the launch with us. The publication itself, a Global Strategy Forum publication, is Beating the 21st Century, Essays on Changing Defence and Security in a Harder World. If you've been receiving your emails and checking them over the last 18 months, you'll have noticed dribs and drabs of this information coming to you from General Sir Richard Barrons, the author of all this fine material, but it's now been put into one publication that we can all enjoy in its entirety. And that's what we're here to discuss today. So our guest with us, General Sir Richard Barrons, who is known to all who come to GSF. He sits on the board, of course, was formerly commander of Joint Forces Command. He was one of 6 chiefs of staff at the time, UK Armed Forces, and has served variously in Bosnia, Kosovo, Northern Ireland, Afghanistan and Iraq. I'm surprised we didn't trip over each other at some point along the way. General Richard, thanks very much indeed for coming in to talk about your publication. And in order to help me pick through some of what we've digested so far from this, I've got with me Professor Michael Clarke, also a well-known character from the GSF, formerly Director General of RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute, still sits on 2 parliamentary committees as advisor, still attached to Exeter University and also King's College, I think, as well. And also a board member of GSF. So an eminent panel. I'm Andrew Wilson. I'm here just to make sure this starts on time and stops on time. And so why don't we get started straight away? First of all, I suppose it was written during a pandemic, General Richard, and it very much reads like that at the start, particularly, observations of that. What was your motivation, do you think, for starting to write all this down? Was it because it was the choice of that, or watching streaming television, or learning to bake bread or something, and you just found yourself with time on your hands? Or was it time to start writing a document like this?
There were 3 reasons why I did this. The first was we were all locked in at home, so I suddenly had time to fill, like a lot of people, and this seemed to me to be a useful project. Secondly, the Global Strategy Forum, which I very much enjoy participating in, didn't meet, and so there was a bit of a void to fill, and I was easily bullied by the director into contributing to the written output. And the third thing is we were in the run-up to the integrated review that was going to reshape UK's defence and security for the future, and so it was a pretty good time to have an opinion on what needed to be done differently.
And that review has since come out, and a lot of the stuff that was in it was stuff that was discussed in your pages as well. Were you surprised when it came out? The bare bones of it was what you talked about in a lot of the chapters in this, in terms of money for new technology, shedding some of the old technology, but principally, and the thing that made the headlines and even got diplomatic responses from around the world, was the shrinking in the number of soldiers involved in an armed force.
Yeah, so I thought there was good news and bad news. I thought the good news was the way in which the government articulated how the world is becoming more threatening, more demanding, full of risk, and also articulated how the way conflict and confrontation are prosecuted is being changed as a result of new technology, particularly combinations of digital age technology. So I thought that they did a pretty good job of saying what's coming is much harder, much more threatening, and needs different treatment. I thought they also articulated the beginnings of the journey to address it, so you could see the germs of ideas about how we're going to transform both military hard power and the government's hybrid campaigning capability. And then I thought there were 3 disappointments. One was the immediate thing was to save money, so stuff was cut before the successors were identified or anywhere near coming into service. Secondly, the journey to being different is a really long one. So I thought there was a fundamental discontinuity between saying the future right now is looking much harder. I mean, as we sit here today, Russia has 175,000 troops surrounding Ukraine, and China is talking about its intention to seize Taiwan if necessary. So the future is kind of here now, but our journey to being ready for it is a long time away. And the final disappointment is the money to invest in driving change is a long way off. It's at least 4 years away. So we're in the stage of having better ideas, but we're not moving quickly enough to enact them.
Michael, I could keep asking questions forever, but I'd like to bring you in now. First of all, give us a quick, your response to the book, and then perhaps you'd like to ask a question of Sir Richard yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as Richard said, I mean, the book deals with a whole series of issues that the integrated review at least touched on, trying to grapple with. I think there's a lot more intellectual coherence and depth in this than there was in the integrated review, but that's inevitable because the review is a government document and it's a policy document. But one of the things that comes through is you say that, the transformation journey is a very long one, and we require governments to stick with it, not just to tick the box and move on. And so do you think that the subsequent governments will stick with it? And in particular for the army, I mean, you understand the army pretty well. Those who don't like what they saw in the review said, look, this is dismantling the army. The Navy and the Air Force know where they're going to be in 2030. They know what their journey. The army doesn't know what its journey is. And in the meantime, before it gets its technology, it's been dismantled. Do you go along with that?
Yes, I do, with some qualifications. So I think two imperatives are really clear. One is the world is becoming much more dangerous. And the UK and countries like us are having to think again, I think for the first time for 30 years, about the return of existential peril. Things could happen to our security and our prosperity and our interests around the world which are not discretionary, to which you have to respond, or our lives will be much the worse for it. And the second thing I think that's clear is this transformation in how defence and security is conducted is underway. And we shouldn't be surprised by this. This is a feature of how the digital age has affected how we live and work and play, and is now changing how we fight. And this will be the most profound transformation of defence and security for over 100 years, possibly even 150 years. I think you have to go back to before the First World War. So this is going to happen. It's a competition. Participation is not discretionary. And the UK is a very long way away from being amongst the winners. And I don't think there are any prizes for being in second place in this. And the army is the most pressing case because it hasn't been recapitalised since the 1990s. It's still stripping out stuff that it got in the 1990s that it's not been able to update. It has until very recently, I think, struggled to work out what a digital age army needs to be. And it has just articulated in quite big handfuls that it's going to transition from something that was built around tanks, armoured infantry and artillery to something that is built around longer range intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance, the primacy of long range precision fires with the close contact battle being something that supports that rather than it being the primary purpose of an army. And secondly, and I think quite well done, it's articulated how the army must do more than just fight state-on-state conflict. It has to do capacity building. So I'm a full supporter of the Rangers Brigade and the Security Force Assistance Brigade. I just think they're undernourished. And the bits that are still missing are, although the thinking about the shape of that army is there, the equipment plan doesn't exist, is not resourced, isn't anywhere close, and an army of 140,000, including about 30,000 reservists, is a token in a world where our opponents are fielding armed forces of hundreds of thousands, even when we combine with our NATO allies. So the absence of growth in size, even if that's through autonomous capability, and the absence of any sort of coherent thinking about mobilization, I think means we're not fully there yet.
You said something in the middle of that answer which goes to a deeper point. You said that the close contact area may not be the essence of the battle in the future. And I understand what you mean by that. Does that affect the whole idea of the boots on the ground argument, that the army, the infantry is there to hold ground that has been taken? Do we have to rethink that?
No, but we should recognise that it's not the only thing you have to do. So I think in the future there are going to be many circumstances where boots are essential on the ground and will have to be there and will have to fight a tough fight. I think in future the boots on the ground recipe will be a mixture of manned, unmanned and increasingly autonomous capabilities, so a different mix, maybe with the soft-bodied humans taking a less prominent role in that. But in addition, we have to recognise that if we built an army around boots on the ground, it wouldn't have a big role where states confront each other at long range through cyber and missiles and social media manipulation. The army doesn't really have a role in that. So we've got to cater for different strategies.
Just one more if I may, just one very quick follow. I'm sorry, I don't mean to hog it, but it's just so interesting. So for young men and women who are thinking of joining the forces, but particularly the army, what can they expect? If a young sort of 17, 18-year-old, traditionally they've said, why join the army now? Why do it now? Actually, what the army is saying is, it's going to be a tremendous challenge. Do you agree?
I don't think certainly in my adult life, there's ever been a better time to join the armed forces for two reasons. One is we're back in a world where the armed forces are facing existential peril. I arguably did that for the first 10 years of my career, with the embers of the Cold War. So armed forces are back to defending their countries, not prosecuting discretionary interventions at the margins of society and interest, like Iraq's and Afghanistan's. And the second thing is this transformation. So join the army now. You are going to be part of building that digital age armed force, manned, unmanned, autonomous, focused on a digital backbone, a completely different way of thinking, organizing, operating, but also fighting. And I think this is a tremendous opportunity.
There's lots in there. I mean, as Michael was saying as well, I think this a couple of times you allude to in your writing about the expense of keeping a standing army. You talk about pensions, you talk about healthcare, you talk about accommodation and all that sort of thing, which seems to point towards this idea that something slimmer is to the advantage, and perhaps the advantage of having more money left over for buying more kit, which might be a new balance for looking at. Unpicking the culture of a large standing army to a smaller standing army, is there a risk you throw away a lot of what makes an army like the British Army what it is, in terms of the regiments, in terms of the sense of what you belong to, the sense of what you're doing, the consistency of your work?
So I think two things don't change. The requirement for the warrior spirit, that is fundamental to all outcomes. And secondly, the cohesion you get at unit level, which our regimental system delivers. But it's got to be more than that. I think as they go down this journey, all nations will discover the advantages of a manned, unmanned, autonomous mix. First of all, they will establish that a lot of modern equipment, it's very sophisticated, but it's not difficult to use, so it'll come in a box essentially, and therefore the requirement to train for weeks and weeks and weeks to be competent with it will diminish, and that means you can think about putting more stuff in the reserves. So I think we are going to see an uplift in the emphasis on reserves, which are clearly cheaper to build and to own, and provided you have worked out your readiness criteria, you'll have them soon enough and good enough when you need them. The second thing is, if you take an autonomous platform, so take a vehicle which has a sensor on it like a radar or a missile, but no humans, then that is going to be cheaper to buy. It's a less complex platform, probably be smaller. It'll be much more disposable. You'll care less if you lose it, so you won't protect it in the same way. And unlike a soldier or a sailor or an aviator or a marine, it won't need to train. It'll just need to be updated in its box. So for autonomous platforms, the cost of ownership will be less, cost of use. And I think we're then going to conceive of a different way of constructing mass in the army, a mixture of the regulars that you need for high readiness, for complexity, and increasingly to do mobilization. And then reserves, which is where I think you get digital age skills from the civil sector and from industry, and you get mass and endurance when you need it. And then industry, which in many cases understands the technology better, so will make this stuff and often maintain it and essentially hand it over when it needs to be used. And then the civil servants who will continue to provide continuity in things like particularly intelligence and logistics, and then robots, which will be part of the mix. And the more people think about autonomous or robotic equipment, you are then stripping out pensions, hospitals, houses, all those things that a human rightly demands. And many European countries spend half their defence budget on manpower. So a manned, unmanned, autonomous mix means you'll probably need fewer regulars, but more of other people, and the overall mix will be sustainably cheaper.
We've seen a real change since the country last mobilised for the Second World War, in that warfare has become something for the British public, something that happens overseas. as a way, it's seen or translated to people as a way of participating in top-level geopolitics, of maintaining the UK's profile as a decision-maker in the world, part of a coalition in Iraq, part of NATO action in Kosovo and in Afghanistan. The general public have just seen it on television. The pandemic has given the country the opportunity, or to be tested for the first time, in terms of role-playing, in terms of going along with some sort of sense of emergency within the public sphere. And a lot of that's been a bit awkward, frankly, in terms of management, event management, as you call it in your book. Do we need to not only press reset on how our armed forces are constructed and what their tasks are, but also what we aspire to our role being in terms of getting involved in what happens around the world?
So I think there are two dimensions to this. One is that in a world of existential peril, the harm comes to the homeland. And I think we'll see we've had 30 years of not having to worry about that since the end of the Cold War, in that rather comfortable US-led, Western-dominated, single superpower world. That's past now. And in the way we see our potential opponents in the world operating cyber capability, the ability to manipulate our social media, and developing long-range precision attack, they mean to be capable of bringing harm to our daily life. So that's focused on the civil population, not on the armed forces. So that theory that when you were going to war, it was only ever an away match, and you could operate in perfect safety and harmony at home to get organised and deployed, I think that era has closed. So we're going to have to worry about resilience, both military and societal, in the future. Then we're going to have to worry about the way that countries confront us every single day now with levers of power that are nothing to do with the military, this so-called hybrid confrontation, or grey space, or tolerance warfare. And that is capable of doing us great harm. We have to be resilient to it, we have to identify it, and we have to be able to do it back. And then we'll do military transformation. So all of this is a very different conception to the armed forces that we've needed in what was called, and is now finished, the post-Cold War era.
I mean, the Salisbury poisonings, which is a classic example, I suppose, of that hybrid grey space warfare, the response was by and large political, wasn't it?
Yes.
That was where that needed to be handled. So you'd at least want some coherence between your armed forces and your body politic in terms of directing yourself against those sort of threats, if they are ultimately to be designated as threats to national security.
So the Skripal incident was, well, I thought, well handled by the government. The response that led to an awful lot of Russian espionage personnel being chucked out around the Western world was more than I think Russia expected, and well handled. But it was seen as an event, and I think that isn't enough for the world we live in. We need to put ourselves and our partners on a campaign footing. So much as we have the collectivization of hard power, we now need the collectivization of hybrid or soft power campaigning, and recognize this is a feature of absolutely every single day. And when we do that, there are three things that are going to be combined. Military hard power, transformed for the digital age, and that's on a path now, but a long way from being good. A government that corrals the public sector, so politics, money, diplomacy, influence, all of the things that a government can do on a campaigning basis. The UK government has spelt out that it needs to do that, but it's not built the machinery to do it or resourced it or acquired the technology to do it well. But most importantly, we have not really addressed how you harness the power of the UK private sector in prosecuting our interests and our security and our prosperity abroad. Because many people around the world are much more interested in the Premier League or our banking system or insurance or cinema or TV and the BBC, all of these things. And our enemies are likely to think we're either feeble or inconsistent if we, say, impose sanctions on key figures we have fallen out with, but still allow them to bank in London and send their children to school and sell them chunks of Knightsbridge. And I think in this hard world that comes, we're going to have to think about how we combine military, public sector and private sector in a coherent effort.
Michael, can I just, to give Sir Richard a break for a second there, is this something you've been having in discussions in the places where you talk about these issues, this docility of our civilian life and the globalization of it at the possible expense of national security, and also that sort of dovetailing of civil and military action going forward?
Yes, I mean, one of my arguments in recent years is that Britain, and Western world in general, but Britain rather distinctively, is more powerful in soft power terms than we normally imagine. But it's very disparate. Governments can't harness soft power very well. But if they could make their own policies more consistent with our soft power strengths, then they would count for more. And I mean, you know, you talk in the book, Richard. I mean, I think your first essay here, the surveillance pandemic, which is interesting. And when I first read it, it brought out to me the notion of the surveillance society, surveillance capitalism, as it's called now, because you know, social media, the power of the Facebooks and Meta, as it's now called, or Twitter, whatever it is, Amazon, Google. All of these organizations is such. They are the Standard Oil New Jerseys of the 21st century. And the way in which technology always works, 3,000 years of recorded history, it always works the same way, which invention, followed by chaotic development, followed by commercialization, and last of all, regulation. Always last of all. So do you feel that the surveillance capitalism has come to the point where it's now very difficult to regulate it in a way that is consistent with our values and the values we want to defend? Has government missed the boat on this somewhat because surveillance technologies and the technologies of the internet, which after all was only invented in 1985, have moved so quickly, much more quickly than television, radio, the steam engine, the internal combustion engine, so fast that governments have missed it?
So I think it's absolutely clear that regulation is lagging well behind the risk that we deal with. And I think one of the things we need to acknowledge is that many of the technologies that constitute surveillance have grown up for very noble purposes in stovepipes. So the advantages or the advances in bioscience are going to affect our healthcare and our pensions and our insurance. The advances in mobile phone technology, smartphone technology, are fantastic in many ways, but they also reveal who we really are, where we go, who we talk to, and what we do. So I think the technology that has grown in the civil sector has been progressed for often noble and very clear commercial applications. And people who make it have not stopped to think about, if you like, the dark side or the manipulation of those technologies. And secondly, I don't think they've stopped to think about how those technologies would combine. So we're going to be in a world where if every single member of a population's DNA is in a database, that would allow a government or anyone else with access to it to understand the makeup of their population and then either to manipulate its future formulation or to award job prospects or social care on the basis of some sort of DNA correlation. That's not a world we want to live in, but in other parts of the world, it's a world that they may find attractive. So we're in a world where people will know by predisposition what we're like. We'll live in a world where, largely through the contents of our mobile phones and our digital exhaust, how we're actually turning out, where we spend our money, who our contacts are, where we go, what we do, what we really think, and who we communicate with. And you can add those two things together. Then the third dimension is, unless you are genuinely off the grid, it's possible to know where each of us is all the time because we carry a phone, we use a card, we drive a car which has got 1,400 chips in it, all of that. And the fourth dimension will be, if you really wanted to, you could build technology that took advantage of knowing who we are by predisposition, how we're performing, and where we are to do something about us. Now you add those things together and you look at it in the context, say, of the Chinese treatment of the Uyghur population, this is on a whole new level. We don't want any truck with that. It's not in accordance with our values. We need to make sure that criminal elements or others, however, with access to this technology, don't take advantage of it. And we need to recognize that others in the world will think very differently. And this, I think, is the peril of regulation, which is there'll be some countries in the world that will want to advance regulation in this sort of technology, knowing full well that a democratic liberal society will apply the regulation and autocracies may or may not, and that would have created a telling advantage.
Your career is, you had a successful career on both sides of the fence, both in public service, in the military, and in the commercial sector. So you've seen both sides of the fence, and you see it now. In Britain's case, in particular, are you confident that there is enough expertise in government, person for person, to actually get hold of what goes on in the commercial sector? Is the government good enough to understand the way the private sector takes forward surveillance technologies?
No. And the reason for that, I think, is many of our public servants, who we should continue to admire for what they've committed to do and their intellectual strength, many of them have not had the education or training or experience to understand how the world is changing. So I think they struggle to see the return of existential peril when their experience has been in counter-terrorism and discretionary interventions. But more than that, the technology we're talking about is grown by big tech. So big tech are creating capability which government doesn't understand. Why would they understand it? And so we have a gap where technology is created which could bring huge advantages to government, but government is staffed by people who understand what they're trying to do but don't understand the technology. The number of people who can bridge that gap is very small. And then that is compounded by the fact if you have a government that is running at full tilt, managing a pandemic and a deficit and many other things, and people who don't know what questions to ask, then you're building a lag. And this is why I think, as you say, regulation is way behind where the technology is, and governments are likely to be overtaken by events, including technological advance.
In many ways, that's a modernisation issue. I mean, the communication between Department of Defence and Downing Street traditionally is a very important part of articulating existential threats to the decision makers. It's an important round table. Are we developing a weakness where, if you think how many prime ministers we've had in the last 10 years, if you think how many secretaries of state for defence we've had in the last 10 years, the turnover, the priorities, the difficulty it is to maintain a position for any period of time in a modern Western democracy at the moment because of the populist way these positions are organised now, are these weaknesses that are there to be exploited, do you think, by more consistent autocratic regimes that watch this going on?
So I would subscribe to the view that an autocracy, I mean, President Putin has been in power for 17 years, is better organised and better able to manage a hard world, at least in the short term. I think the peril with democracies, including our own here in the UK, is that we have a political class that is not educated or trained in the sorts of things we're talking about, and it's not really interested because the population isn't interested. There's no vibrant debate in civil society about the things we're talking about. So their attention is elsewhere and their preferences are elsewhere. And that's compounded by civil servants and other officials who have followed a similar journey. So the first challenge, I think, is there's a big deficit in understanding about how this world is changing. And then the second thing is, I think there is a competence gap because we are still putting frankly gifted people in jobs where they exercise enormous authority for which they have very little capability and experience to discharge well. And I don't believe in government in being an exercise for people to go on a learning journey. I'd expect competent people in posts for a long time.
You talk in one of these essays about leadership and followership, which I find very interesting. I mean, can I just draw you out a little bit on, what are the eternal verities of leadership, things that just never change, as opposed to the things that are very specifically now 21st century challenges, because we all lament the fact that we don't feel as if we're being very well led in the Western world at the moment. Now, is that just a coincidence of leaders with particular problems, or is there something more fundamental about the problem of leadership and followership, as you call it, in the current era?
So I don't think the essence of leadership has ever changed. At the heart of it, I would always cite the primacy of moral courage and integrity and commitment. I think there is a second order issue, which is in the world we live in, we need leaders that can understand this world, provide the vision to articulate what it's like, and then have the moral courage and the judgment to take hard decisions before they're forced by the sway of public opinion on the instant or events to respond to something. And we have a political class which is generally living in the moment and focused on managing things like the NHS. It doesn't want to think more broadly. In other words, I think there's a statesmanship deficit. Now, I think that's understandable, but I don't think it's going to be enough in the future. And then we need a civil service and a society that demands this of their politicians and accepts the need to take hard decisions and to break out of this sense that we lead individual lives in perfect liberty and freedom, and then when something bad happens, it's the government's job to sort it out and for someone else to pay the bill. But we're not going to live in that sort of world.
I mean, a lot of us sit around at dinners with politicians, present politicians or retired politicians, and they often will admit the same thing. They say, look, we know exactly what to do about this or that. We just don't know how to get elected afterwards.
Yes.
That's the problem. That's the point.
Yes. So I'm often asked, are we good enough to have these conversations, to make the changes in the way we govern ourselves, and that's a combination of politicians, officials and civil society, or are we going to have to get done over first and then drag ourselves out of the ashes? I think historically it's more likely we get done over, and I just hope that there's enough ash to step out of. And I regret that I have had to come to that conclusion. Surely, being the sort of country we are, we should be good enough to see how things are changing and the need to protect ourselves and our children's future and do things differently.
And the creation of containment and free trade and the World Trade Organization and the United Nations and all that went with it, all those things that were created between 1945 and 1950, say, proves it could be done. There are moments in history when sometimes these things are done and the world sticks with them for half a century or more.
Yes, and I think that's a superb example, because when that happened, we were in the aftermath of a terrible world war, and we were in a place where America could set the tone, and most of us followed. The debate we are now having is a multipolar world where there's going to be a conversation between, I think, the US-led West and China about what an international rules-based order looks like and how the world works. I think China understands that. I think the West is torn between hoping very much indeed that the old world reassets itself and beginning to address taking difficult, hard decisions that will be at the expense of current consumption and enjoyment in order to be better set for the future. And it's clearly in our own self-interest to have that conversation with China in a better organised frame than we are now, or we will, understandably, get done over.
Of course, I mean, rebuilding in 1945, there really were ashes everywhere. I mean, that was starting from scratch again. And so it stands to reason that things were built in a certain sensible way and had a certain longevity built into them and so on. But if you look at, you mentioned the climate crisis a few times in the book as well. And if you look at the climate crisis, the people recognize that but are reluctant to actually make any impacts on their own lives, which would make their lives more even inconvenienced, let alone difficult, in order to participate in helping that.
Yeah.
And also in the pandemic, we've seen people unwilling often to inconvenience themselves. So that mobilization, that call to arms is clearly quite a challenge, and suggests that it's more likely that you take a beating first before you pick yourself up rather than voluntarily reorganize. But have you had any thoughts about how one might approach that big reset to try and make the West a bit more competitive when you look at the mobilization and organization or autocratic societies that we're looking at now, which are our principal threats in China and Russia?
So first of all, I think there's a big job to be done. And actually there are seeds of this in the Integrated Review document itself, where we articulate to ourselves that the future that we're going to embrace will be a combination of the consequences of the rise of China, whether it thinks strategically or is just clumsy, combined with the effects of population growth and climate change, combined with the digital age and the way it reshapes economies and societies and relationships between states. And that's quite a toxic mix, but in there is real peril. I think very few people are prepared to make the case for what that could mean and then articulate the changes in policies and resourcing to be better prepared for it, because it will be at the consequence of things we enjoy right now. Having tried to do this on a number of occasions in a number of ways. I think it is pretty fruitless for people like me to write essays, articles, even if they're collected in the stocking filler of choice for Christmas, in the hope that it will sway public opinion. And where I think this goes now is people like me need to be attached to the world of frankly, entertainment, to our best storytellers. And my ambition would be to create the film or the box set that the UK and other people sit down to on a Sunday night, which sets out this story and so moves them to think differently about the future that it has a political effect and causes politicians to do that. So I think entertainment at mass scale, well done, is likely to move the needle more than any more policy documents or thing. And even with that, I think something terrible has to happen before we wake up and then impose these changes on ourselves. It would be nice if that something terrible was manageable and somewhere else.
He's talking about a 21st century version of Downton Abbey.
I was thinking more of Jaws, where no one went swimming for the next 10 years after they've read the book or watched the film.
Yeah.
That's very interesting, but that encapsulates the concern about trying to buy into some public support for a direction of travel that perhaps we're unaware of or unable to articulate to our public at the moment. And that would suggest, again, how do we articulate the existential peril that you've mentioned a couple of times, or the existential threat? For example, head of MI6 at the moment, Richard Moore, stood up and said, our principal threat is China, but actually Russia's a bit more immediate at the moment. And immediately the questions were, well, so which one's worse? Which is the one you're most worried about? And he was literally sort of China, but actually, well, Russia as well. And they're two very different threats, aren't they? It's difficult for us. We still think of threat as being invasion. We still think of an existential threat to the UK as being people putting jackboots on our soil. But it's not. That's not the threat, is it?
No, it's really not. There's a much broader spectrum of risk to our security and our prosperity and our values. And we absolutely have to break out of this desire for only dealing with one thing at once, like a pandemic. We are going to deal with concurrent peril, and I described that combination: the rise of China, population growth, climate change, and the digital age. And as we turn into Christmas now, we are looking at Russian forces poised around Ukraine. We're also looking at China making big noises about its ability to seize Taiwan. And what if, in early 22, both of those things happened at once because we were asleep and having Christmas? Now, that is not impossible. It's definitely unpalatable. But we need to be able to think in those terms. And it's only by giving ourselves the imperative on the shock of thinking like that then we'll see that, no, we need to get on with transforming the armed forces and rebuilding our resilience and building collective hybrid responses with our allies, because otherwise we will be overwhelmed by this peril in combination, and it won't come at us one thing at once.
Could these things be a Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo? Again, a spark that lights a chain of events that drags people in, willing or otherwise?
Well, I think there are some aspects of the world today that feel like 1938, 1939. It's not the same, but in a military sense, if we take the potential for China to seize Taiwan, there would be a military dimension to that. But the consequences of that would surely break international trade, would break the internet, would break international finance, and would put the world in a place that felt a lot like October 1914, in ways that are predictable but have not been predicted.
You've spoken, Richard, about, you say we always define our era in terms of post-something, post-war, post-Second World War, post-Cold War, post-9/11, and you have said maybe we should define ourselves as pre-war, and that frightens people when you say that.
Yeah.
But in what respects? If we said, okay, we think we might be in a pre-war era, in what way would that make us feel differently?
So I think now we are. I think that paradigm of bringing pre-war works well with the sort of hybrid threats that are projected at us every day, whether that's migration, as we saw just recently coming from Belarus into the European Union, or in cyberspace, or in the tinkering around in our national narrative through social media, or through military signaling around the world. So we're already in a place where those countries that do not share our values or our interests and are jealous of the advantage that we once had in the world but are now ceding, they are already pinning us back. And they'll probably want to see how far they can get to that. The key question is, what is the spark that causes that to transition from confrontation into armed conflict? And it's likely to be, I think, for one of two reasons. The first would be one of our potential opponents feel that a vital national interest is at stake for them. Is that Ukraine? Is that Taiwan? Is that the South China Sea? I don't know. And secondly, when that spark occurs, everyone thinks they're going to win, and they're going to win by Christmas. That seems to be a feature of these things. But it releases a head of steam. It just unlocks, in a very human way, that feral, brutal dimension of mankind, which is, when pushed, we fight. And we fight even when we know it's a daft thing to do, until we're sufficiently battered that we decide to stop.
Now, a lot of people out there would say, when you say that we should think of ourselves in a pre-war mentality, people say, oh, well, he's ex-military, he's just a warmonger. And you wrote a very interesting essay, which I found very eye-catching in here. So, is it time for a military coup? And the answer, of course, is no, it isn't. But you were talking here about the way the military thinks about things and the ways of thinking. I mean, can I just invite you to offer us some views on, what is it about military thinking that is useful, and what shouldn't we take from the military in thinking about some of these issues?
So there are some things the military do very well because they are invested in a common way of working. So militaries understand strategy not as a list of desirable outcomes which you generally march towards, but as a thoughtful construct of reconciling ends, ways and means. And that means that you can conceive of your future and how to get there in a logical, thoughtful way. That is not a common experience in government or civil society. The second thing I think that the military do well is they understand leadership in uncertainty and in hard times, where the leader has to lead, has to take difficult decisions, even at the expense of the people they're responsible for. And that is not in the nature of democratic politics in comfortable times. And the third thing I think the military do well is that they understand delegation and empowerment. It's called mission command, and they can make that work. And the fourth thing is they understand logistics and operations in ways that people who are focused on, say, policy or a very simple set of tasks don't do naturally. So what I advocate is there are aspects of military thinking and operating that could very usefully bleed into other bits of government and indeed commercial affairs. I very much regret that there's a sort of stereotypical rejection of that, because many people look at me and the only general they've seen before is General Melchett in Blackadder.
Yeah. Armchair generals, that's what you are.
Yes.
Armchair generals.
And so why would my experience and those of my many peers have anything to value to commercial or political life? And I think that's naive. So it's part of this question of education and training. And very interesting that in recent times the armed forces have stepped in to provide planning and logistics support, even managing the fringes of a pandemic in very small numbers. So to some degree that point is being made for us. The bits of the military that are just not useful to import are aspects of military culture which are to do with being a warrior and unlimited liability. They don't fit civil society well. And I'm frequently challenged by people who say, well, you could do other things, but you get things done by shouting. And because you're used to dealing with hierarchical automatons, well, that's just betrays an enormous...
Military doesn't work that way, actually.
It betrays an enormous misunderstanding. So you sometimes have to struggle to get past these stereotypes.
Final thought from you, Michael?
No, only that actually the whole series of essays I thought was startling, and I was caught between whether it was a dystopian vision of the future or an optimistic vision of the future. And I think I've read them twice now. I read them when they first came out, and I read them when they were in this form to write the foreword for it, which I was very happy to do. If I read them again, it would depend on which side of the bed I get out of, I think. I don't know if they're dystopian or actually they're rather optimistic.
So I think what I'm trying to say is, if we go on as we are, the world is going to bite us in the arse and it will really hurt. That we are good enough to change and we're powerful enough for this not to happen, and we should do it. So right now, in the absence of these bad things manifesting themselves at scale and at pace, I'd like to be optimistic that we could just improve. In my darker moments, on the other side of the bed, I think we'll be overtaken by events.
Final thought then, Richard, is looking at that, and we know that this is all a continuum, an evolution of relationships between different forces in the world and climate change and different countries and state actors and so on. We've even changed our attitude as a public in this country towards China since 2015 till now, just because of what we've learned, how things have evolved, the introduction of the security issue. We all thought it was just a cash point machine that we could help ourselves to once, and now we realize that that's different. So that evolution has the power of change. What would you like to push? What buttons would you like to push if you could to wake up sectors of civil society in the UK, say, to being more on top of the developments around the world, or painting the picture? You mentioned that excellent idea, I think, of bringing entertainment and fiction into it, which I hadn't thought of, and of course makes a very good point in itself. But how would you like to see perhaps closing that communication gap between one side of Whitehall and the other, in terms of energy and decision-making and the sort of politics that you think our country should be pursuing in order to enable what you see as being some of the remedies to the problems we face?
So I think the first thing is this has to be led by politics and politicians. And the first thing I would ask is that they invest in understanding what this world really is and how to operate as a politician capable of being a statesman in this world. So that's about reinventing our own politics. Secondly, in terms of civil society, I wish our media enterprises as a whole would break free of, on a daily basis, telling us what's happened in America, never telling us what's happening in China or really Russia, and begin to draw these threads together better in the way that mainstream media can do very well if it applies itself to it. And then I think the third thing is in the education in schools and universities needs to pay more attention to this. But I still think the most powerful tool here will be the best storytellers, filmmakers, seizing on this and putting the narrative in the way they do so well to really wake people up.
Well, General Sir Richard Barrons, thanks so much for the conversation, and thanks for letting us go through with you some of the content in your great collection of essays that you provided the GSF over the course of the pandemic. It's been a fascinating conversation for us, a fascinating conversation for you, Michael, as well. Thanks to Professor Michael Clarke as well for joining us for the conversation. I do know one thing for sure, and that is that Michael Ancram, Lord Lothian, would have loved to have been here, and he will be back soon. He's very keen to get back down to London and start joining these events, as we are for all of you to start joining us in person again at the Liberal Club instead of online, as we've been doing so far. So it just remains for me once again to thank this fantastic panel that we have here today, to encourage you to take a look at the Beating the 21st Century, Essays on Changing Defence and Security in a Harder World, when it arrives on your doorstep. It's a great read, so enjoy that as well. Thanks very much indeed for joining us here on GSF.